In the beginning, Parashah 1. Last Shabbat, we observed the seventh Holy Convocation, as spoken about in Vayikra, or Leviticus chapter 23, which was also Shemini Atzeret, the eighth day of Sukkot. But because of observing the eighth day in accordance with our Aviv calendar, we did not begin the Torah cycle with the readings of Parashah 1 last Shabbat. But rather than pursuing the Parashah sequence during the rest of the scriptural year, I want to turn our attention towards the events that are playing out in the world today, with a strong emphasis on the book of Revelation, which will help to bring many previously misunderstood end-time events perhaps into sharper focus. Particularly since the 7th of October last year, 2023, because of what occurred on that day and the subsequent events over the last 12 months, it is important for us to look more deeply into the scriptural message from both the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah as they relate to the current events in this world scene. As in previous years, there will be many times when we will still be reading portions from the weekly parashah as we did today, along with selected readings from the prophets and the Brit Hadashah, which will often differ from those recommended in the CJB. By selecting many diverse readings, the aim will be to allow the Ruach HaKodesh to unlock the scriptural narrative in ways that hopefully will provide you with an ever deeper appreciation of how the sovereign plan of God has been revealed progressively through many stages of the scriptural narrative. While drawing on many diverse portions of Scripture, rather than the normally prescribed readings, we will see more clearly that the words given to Moshe are synonymous with the words spoken by Yeshua, the promised Messiah of Israel. Therefore, the relationship between Yahweh in the Tanakh and Yeshua in the Brit Hadashah is confirmed through the words that we read in Yochanan, or John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, where he said, of course, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and all things came to be through him, and without him nothing was made that has been." Having acknowledged the relationship between Yahweh and Yeshua, I want to now look again at chapter 1 of Bereshit, Genesis, and to recognize the enigmatic words used to explain the creation process. As we're told, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So when we place those words alongside the opening words of Yochanan's Gospel, we see that they are both focusing on the creation of the whole universe, including planet Earth. However, between verses 1 and 2 of Bereshit chapter 1, there is an unspecified period, which modern science now suggests was in the order of billions of years. But the actual time factor is not our only focus as we're considering particularly the scriptures as we read them. Because the Eternal One, God, through Yeshua as the Word, starting in verse 3, said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So God, the Creator, began a lengthy process of preparing planet Earth for the habitation by humanity, the details of which are recorded in the rest of Bereshit chapter 1. However, this is not the time to dissect the details of those 6 stages of development. Suffice to say that each task in chapter 1 took far longer than 6 literal 24-hour days. Regrettably, that became the fundamental teaching of both rabbinical Judaism and Christianity for over 2 millennia. Even though the Hebrew word yom does reflect many different periods of time, the commentators have actually constrained it to implying just 24-hour cycle of light and darkness, which we of course call day. But that does not reflect reality. Finally, God's creative activity climaxed during the latter part of that sixth yom, as we're told in 1 verse 24 to 27. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. That was the completion of God's creative work. So we see in verses 28 and 31, God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and every living creature that crawls on the earth." God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So there was evening and there was morning, a sixth day. That was the end of the creative cycle, and God was well pleased with his creation. So moving on to chapter 2, which begins by speaking about the seventh creative day. In verses 1 through 3, God confirms that the creative work was complete by saying, God blessed the seventh day and separated it as holy, because on that day God rested from all his work which he had created, so that it itself could produce. Now the words in verse 3 are vitally important because they help to define the length of that creative cycle. By saying God rested on the seventh day means all creative work ceased. So, what had been created could itself produce. That means that the whole of creation from that point forward had the ability to reproduce and multiply just as God had ordained it should do. It became self-sustaining from that time onward without needing any further input from the Creator. So how long was that seventh creative yom or day meant to last? In answering that question, we need to search right through the scriptures, because the length of the seventh creative day is not defined in the first chapter of Bereshit. Instead, we find a definitive answer is not given until it is explained by Shaul in Hebrews chapter 4. There he, Shaul, defines the future of all who are called by the Ruach HaKodesh because that they've put their trust in Yeshua. In Hebrews chapter 12, Shaul shows that for the first century Jewish community living in Rome, that unless they acknowledged and trusted Yeshua, they would not enter into God's rest. Through the words of chapter 4, Shaul reflects on the words of King David in Psalm 95, where David was speaking about the generation who actually stood at Mount Horeb or Sinai, saying that they also would not enter into God's rest because of their lack of trust. David could speak about being able to enter into God's rest, and he spoke many centuries before Shaul. So Shaul was actually repeating the words of David to his first century audience. Therefore, it follows that the words of both David and Shaul must also apply even today in the 21st century. Therefore, the words taken from Hebrews chapter 4 verses 3 to 4, it says, "It is just as he, God, said, in my anger I swore that they would not enter into my rest." He swore that way even though his work had been in existence since the founding of the universe. For there is a place where it also said concerning the seventh day, "And God rested on the seventh day from all his work." Hence Shaul's words reflect the words of Bereshit chapter 2 verse 2, where we see that if God the Creator has been resting from his creative works through the last 6,000 years of human development, with still yet another 1,000 years of restoration yet to come during the reign of Yeshua, therefore all 7,000 years of human development and restoration must pass before that seventh creative day of God's rest can finally end. So if the seventh creative day is 7,000 years long, then it follows that the 6 creative days in Bereshit chapter 1 must have been of equal length. Therefore, I suggest that each of God's 6 creative days were also 7,000 years long. That means 6 creative days in Bereshit chapter 1 would have spanned a period of 42,000 years. So moving on to consider chapter 2, in verses 7 through 9, we see that there is a change of creative focus from the universal to the specific. The last verse of chapter 1 speaks about the creation of humankind as a whole, while in chapter 2 verse 7 it speaks about the formation of just one unique man, Adam. In that verse we also see for the first time the name Yahweh mentioned alongside God. Yahweh God was the one who formed Adam from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Adam became a living being. Having formed Adam, in verses 8 and 9, it says, Yahweh God placed Adam in the garden and provided seed-bearing trees for food for Adam. Yahweh also placed 2 special trees in the middle of that garden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. It was only the fruit of the latter tree that Adam was forbidden to eat, because it would have revealed the difference between good and evil. That was something that Adam did not need to know at that stage of his development. Clearly, from the description, the garden must have been a special place, set apart from the rest of the world. But in verse 18, Yahweh God said, it was not good for the person to be alone there, as there were no animals in that garden at that stage. Then Yahweh God brought the animals and the birds to Adam, so that he could name them. But Adam still remained without a personal soulmate, a companion of his own kind. So Yahweh God brought forth Havah from the rib of Adam. They became one flesh, and they were naked. Even with all the animals around them, they had no reason to feel ashamed or self-aware, because there were no other human beings in the garden. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. And we need to reflect for a moment that Adam was the first human being spoken about in detail, by contrast with the latter verses of chapter 1, where God, the Creator, spoke universally about humankind, whom he had created, and he said they were both male and female, is the way he created them. In chapter 2, verse 7, we're introduced to Yahweh God, where we find that the narrative switches from the universal description about humankind to the specific focus on Adam himself, and more detailed description of his formation and his placement in Gan-Eden. The detailed focus on Adam is important because the words of Bereshit chapter 2 are strikingly similar to what we read in Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 1 through 14. Firstly, we are told in Bereshit chapter 2 verse 7, then Yahweh God formed a person from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living being. Adam was the foundational reflection of what Yeshua will do for the whole of Israel when he awakens them following his return. Adam was the first man into whom Yahweh God breathed life so that he became a living being. In the same way, Yeshua will breathe life into the people of Israel in Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14, where it describes the dry bones of the dead are brought back together, reformed into complete human beings. Then in verse 9, having reformed the people, Yahweh Elohim says, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, human being. Say to the breath that Yahweh Elohim says, come from the four winds, breathe and breath on the slain so that they can come to life. Just as Yahweh Elohim, or Yahweh God, whom we now know as to be Yeshua, breathed on Adam as he placed him in Gan-Eden, so also in Ezekiel we're told in 37:12, then Yahweh Elohim said, my people, I will open your graves and make you get up out of your graves, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. In a similar manner, Shaul, also under the inspiration of the Ruach HaKodesh, reveals the relationship between Adam and Yeshua. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 45 to 49, it says, the Tanakh says, Adam, the first man, became a living human being, but the last Adam has become a life-giving spirit. Note, however, that the body from the spirit did not come first, but the ordinary human one. The one from the spirit comes afterwards. The first man is from the earth, made from dust. The second man is from heaven. People born of dust like the man of dust, and people born from heaven like the man from heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, so also we shall bear the image of the man from heaven. Here Shaul is showing that all who are called by Yeshua in this life will be made immortal when he returns, while the rest of mankind, along with the greater majority of Israel, will be raised to mortal life, to live during the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua's redemption. So returning back to Bereshit chapter 3, we read about the events that changed the course of human history of mankind. Having formed both Adam and Havah, Yahweh God gave Adam authority over all the animals and the birds, both domestic and wild. They were only given one constraint by Yahweh God. That was that they were told not to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree of knowledge. Now, we all know the story of how the serpent deceived Havah and then Adam. Having been deceived by the serpent and having eaten the forbidden fruit, Yahweh God invoked the words that had been spoken to Adam in 2:16. On that day that you eat it from it, it becomes certain that you will die. As we also know, it was Satan, the adversary, who spoke to Havah through the serpent. But it is seldom realized that the adversary has never made himself visible at any stage during human history. However, he's always managed to impact the lives of millions of people, both Jews and non-Jews. Not once has he ever made himself seen, made himself visible. He has always worked through proxies, just like the axis of evil at this very time is still working through proxies. But the consequence of the adversary's deception is set forth clearly in Bereshit chapter 3 verse 15, which has been the most enduring judgmental edict Yahweh ever laid down. Yahweh God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than any of the livestock and the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust as long as you live. I will put animosity between you and the woman, and between your descendant and her descendant, and he will bruise you in the head, and you will bruise him in the heel. So what is the profound significance of that verse? As we now know through the words of Yochanan, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, that Yahweh God was Yeshua in his pre-human form, and as such was the one who placed Adam and Havah in Gan-Eden. However, Satan was also in Gan-Eden, the garden of God, at that time, as we read in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 and 13, when Yahweh said to Satan, who was disguising himself as the serpent, "Human being, Ezekiel, raised a lament against the prince of Zeor, and tell him that Yahweh Elohim says to you, you put a seal on perfection. You were full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God." Then in verses 14 through 16, you were the Kerev, protecting a large region. I placed you on God's mountain. You walked back and forth among stones of fire. You were perfect in all in your ways from the day you were created, until unrighteousness was found in you. When your commerce or self-importance grew, you became full of violence, and in that way you sinned. Therefore I have thrown you out, defiled from the mountain of God. I have destroyed you, protecting Kerev from among the stones of fire. As we can see from those verses that Satan was given responsibility and the oversight and protection for a large region of the earth, but because of his own self-importance, he became corrupt in the eyes of Yahweh God. So there remains, even to this day, constant animosity between Satan and Yeshua. That struggle for supremacy over humanity and all created things has continued right down to this day. Even though Yeshua was given full authority in heaven and on earth, on the day he presented himself to his Father in Bikurim 30 CE, even today that struggle still continues, because until the end of the 7th millennium, when Satan is finally let loose from his pit, the struggle cannot be finally terminated. However, as Bereshit chapter 3 verse 15 says, it will be Yeshua who will finally bruise Satan in the head, meaning Yeshua will destroy him completely on the 8th creative day. So through that constant struggle between Yeshua and Satan, we can begin to understand the reality of what is actually happening in the Middle East today. We need to realize that the political and military power plays in the Middle East are really a human reflection of what is being played out between Yeshua and Satan. The conflict between Israel and the Islamic proxies is a visible expression of the greater celestial battle that is raging and has been raging since Gan-Eden. The concluding verses of Ezekiel chapter 28 give a deep insight into the current happenings between the axis of evil and Israel at this particular time. Ezekiel 28 verses 20 through 26 sum up what lies ahead in the battle between Israel and Hezbollah. It also spells out the future of the fate for Lebanon. Firstly, the place mentioned is Sidon, which is situated 29 kilometers north of the mouth of the Tani River in Lebanon. It is the border that the UN mandated for Hezbollah under the Security Council Resolution 1701, which was decreed in August 2006. It was a resolution that required Infel, the forces of the UN, to ensure that Hezbollah remained north of the Litani River. So it is fitting that Ezekiel Chapter 28 verse 21, where Yahweh said, "Human being, turn your face toward Sidon and prophesy against it." Then he continues on in the following verse by saying how Sidon will be judged. As it says in verse 23, "For I will send plague into her, and blood flow in her streets. Attacked from all sides by the sword, the wounded will fall within her. Then they will know that I am Yahweh." Then in relation to Israel, he says in the very next verse, 24, "The house of Israel will no longer have a briar pricking away at them. No longer will its contemptuous neighbors be like a thorn stabbing them. Then they will know that I am Yahweh Elohim." Those words are so fitting in relation to the present conflict that is happening between Israel and Hezbollah. Then in verses 25 and 26, we're told how things will be sorted out once Yeshua has returned and all Israel is gathered. That is, resurrected and returned to earth from every corner of the earth, from most distant places. All that will happen following the return of Yeshua and will bring an end not only to the Middle East conflict, but also the influence of Satan, the influence Satan has among the nations of the world. Satan, of course, will be bound for 1,000 years, as we're told in Revelation chapter 20, verse 1 and 2, where he said, "Where I saw the angel coming down from heaven, who had the key to the abyss, had a great chain in his hand, and he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, the adversary, and chained him for 1,000 years." Then finally, the edict made by Yahweh God in Bereshit 3:15 will be completely fulfilled, as stated in Revelation 20 verse 10. The adversary who deceived them was hurled into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So in conclusion, we see that by placing the words of the first parashah, Bereshit, alongside the words of Revelation chapter 20, we begin to see both ends of the scriptural narrative as they relate to human development. Together, they're like bookends, supporting 66 books of the Bible that together form the whole narrative of the sovereign plan of God as it has been played out in relationship to humanity. So having considered many aspects of the creative narrative and having exposed the continuing struggle for world supremacy between Yeshua and Satan, which has led to the situation Israel is now facing, I hope I have laid a solid foundation for what we are going to consider throughout the rest of this scriptural year. Shabbat Shalom.